March 1945, somewhere over Nazi Germany. A B-24 Liberator squadron is getting torn apart by enemy fire. The bomber crews are terrified, engines screaming, flak bursting all around them. And leading this mission, coordinating everything from another aircraft, is one of Hollywood's biggest stars. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Jimmy Stewart didn't have to be there. He could have stayed home, made propaganda films, done war bond tour, and been celebrated as a hero. Instead, he risked everything to become one of the most accomplished combat officers of World War II. And after the war, his story gets even stranger. Because sitting in a California hangar right now is a P-51 Mustang called Thunderbird, a plane that broke speed records and carried Stewart's legacy into the jet age. But the connection between Jimmy Stewart and this particular aircraft reveals something most people never knew about the man behind Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This is the story of how America's most beloved actor became a warrior and how one extraordinary aircraft became a symbol of everything he fought for. James Maitland Stewart was born in 1908 in Indiana, Pennsylvania, into a family that valued duty above everything else. His father ran a hardware store, and the Stewart family had sent men to fight in every American war since the Civil War, but young Jimmy seemed destined for a different kind of life entirely. He was shy, awkward, painfully thin. At Princeton, he studied architecture, not drama. The stage found him almost by accident when a friend dragged him to a theater group. But once he discovered acting, something clicked. By 1935, he was in Hollywood. By 1940, he'd won an Academy Award for the Philadelphia Story. He was on top of the world, and then everything changed. In 1940, before Pearl Harbor, before America entered the war, Stewart did something that shocked Hollywood. He enlisted, not after he was drafted, not because of public pressure. He walked into a recruitment office and volunteered. There was just one problem: they rejected him. At 138 pounds, Stewart was underweight for the Army Air Corps. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. A convenient excuse to sit out the war, but Stewart spent the next few months systematically gaining weight, eating constantly, exercising obsessively. He came back and enlisted again. This time they took him. Now, the Army knew what they had. A famous actor could be incredibly valuable for morale. They wanted to make him a public relations officer, keep him stateside, have him smile for cameras and sell war bonds. It was safe, it was smart, and Stewart wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. He fought the assignment, he pulled strings. He made himself such a persistent problem that they finally relented and sent him to flight school. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Stewart wasn't just trying to fly, he already knew how to fly. He'd earned his private pilot's license in 1935, years before the war. He'd logged hundreds of hours in his own aircraft. When everyone thought he was just a movie star playing dress-up, Stewart was actually one of the most experienced civilian pilots in Hollywood. The instructors at flight school were stunned. This gangly actor could handle a bomber better than men who'd been in the service for years. By 1943, he wasn't just a pilot. He was a squadron commander, Captain James Stewart. Then Major, then Lieutenant Colonel, and in November 1943, he arrived in England to lead real combat missions over Nazi Germany. The 445th Bombardment Group based in Tibenham, England. This was Stewart's new home, and it was about as far from Hollywood as you could get. Cold, muddy, and every morning men climbed into bombers knowing some of them wouldn't come back. Stewart's job was to lead these men into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. The B-24 Liberator missions over Germany weren't like the movies. There was no background music, no heroic speeches. Just hours of cold terror and flak explosions that could tear a bomber apart in seconds. German fighters would dive through the formations, cannons blazing. Men died in ways that were quick and brutal, or slow and agonizing. And Stewart was right there in the middle of it. His first mission was to hit Nazi targets in France. then deeper into Germany, then Berlin itself. Each mission more dangerous than the last. His crews later remembered that Stewart never ordered anyone to do anything he wouldn't do himself. If it was a particularly deadly mission, Stewart flew it. When other commanders might have stayed back and sent their men forward, Stewart led from the front. There's a moment that captures who he was as a commander. During one mission, a bomber in his formation was hit badly. Engine on fire, half the crew wounded, the pilot was trying to decide whether to bail out over enemy territory or try to make it back to England. Stewart got on the radio. His voice, that distinctive drawl everyone knew from the movies, calm as if he were discussing the weather, "Stay with it. I'll guide you home," and he did. For over an hour, Stewart flew alongside that crippled bomber, talking the pilot through every decision, adjusting the formation to protect the damaged aircraft from fighters. All of them made it back, but not everyone was so lucky. The losses were staggering. The 445th had some of the highest casualty rates of any bombardment group in England. Stewart watched friends die. He wrote letters to families, trying to find words that might matter, and something inside him began to change. The nightmares started while he was still in England, the trembling hands. What we now recognize as PTSD, but in 1944, there was no therapy, no counseling, you just kept flying. By the time his combat tour ended, Stewart had flown 20 combat missions, many as the lead pilot or commanding officer. He'd been promoted to colonel, he'd earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, and the French Croix de Guerre. He was 37 years old and looked 10 years older. When the war ended in 1945, Colonel James Stewart returned to America as one of the most decorated actors in Hollywood history. But the man who came home wasn't the same man who'd left. Here's what most people don't know. Stewart never really left the military. When he returned to Hollywood in 1945, his career was in trouble. The roles that had made him famous felt wrong now. The boyish charm seemed forced. Directors didn't know what to do with this harder, older version of Jimmy Stewart. His first few films bombed at the box office, but Stewart had changed in ways that went beyond his acting. The war had given him something unexpected, a love for military aviation that he couldn't shake. While other veterans were hanging up their uniforms forever, Stewart joined the Air Force Reserve. This wasn't ceremonial. This wasn't showing up once a year for a photo op. Stewart continued flying, continued training, continued studying military aviation tactics. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, he balanced 2 completely different lives: Hollywood star during the week, Air Force officer on weekends and holidays. He eventually climbed to the rank of brigadier general. Think about that. A 1-star general who was also making movies with Hitchcock. It's almost absurd. During the Vietnam War, when he was in his 60s, Stewart tried to return to combat. He lobbied to fly missions over Vietnam, to lead men into battle one more time. The Air Force, understandably, said absolutely not. They couldn't risk losing a general, especially one who was also a national treasure. But his son, Ronald Stewart, did go to Vietnam as a Marine lieutenant. And in 1969, Ronald was killed in action. Stewart never really talked about it publicly. He gave one brief statement and then fell silent on the subject for the rest of his life. But people close to him said that loss, that specific loss, changed him more than anything else. His son had followed the Stewart family tradition, going to war just like every Stewart man before him. And this time, the cost was unbearable. Now, let's talk about that P-51 Mustang. The North American P-51 was arguably the best fighter aircraft of World War II, fast, agile, with the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was the plane that finally gave American bombers a fighting chance over Germany. But our story involves a very particular P-51D serial number 44744-5 that would eventually be known as Thunderbird. This aircraft was built in 1944 at North American Aviation's plant in California. It saw combat in Europe, though its exact service record from the war years remains partly classified. After the war ended, like thousands of other military aircraft, it was surplused, sold off to civilian buyers. And here's where things get fascinating. In the early 1960s, a race pilot named Bob Hoover acquired this particular Mustang. Hoover was a legend in aviation circles, a test pilot who'd flown with Chuck Yeager, a man who could make an aircraft do things that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Hoover modified the P-51, stripping weight, tuning the engine, turning it into a pure racing machine. He painted it in a distinctive color scheme, white with red, yellow, and black accents inspired by Native American art, hence the name Thunderbird. On September 14, 1965, Hoover took Thunderbird to the Reno Air Races and set a new world speed record for piston-engine aircraft in its class. The record stood for years, but here's the connection most people miss. Bob Hoover and Jimmy Stewart knew each other. They'd met through military aviation circles in the 1940s and remained friends for decades. Both men were passionate about flying, both were meticulous pilots, and both understood what military service meant. When Stewart learned about Hoover's speed record in Thunderbird, he made a point of visiting the aircraft, of sitting in the cockpit, of talking shop with Hoover about performance modifications and engine tuning. For Stewart, this wasn't just a friend's racing plane. This was a P-51, the fighter that had protected his bombers over Germany, the aircraft that represented everything the Allied air war had been fighting for. There's a photograph from the late 1960s, not well known, of Stewart standing next to Thunderbird. He's in civilian clothes, but his posture is pure military. He is studying the aircraft with the eye of a pilot who understands exactly what he is looking at. In that moment, you can see both versions of James Stewart, the Hollywood icon and the Air Force general, brought together by a machine that represented the best of American aviation engineering. The later years of Stewart's life are well documented. He kept acting into his 70s. He became America's grandfather figure, beloved, trusted, genuine. But he also kept flying. Even into his 80s, Stewart would show up at air shows and military events. He'd stand next to vintage B-24s and B-17s, and he'd remember. Veterans would seek him out, wanting to meet the movie star who'd actually been there, who'd actually flown the missions, who understood what it meant to climb into a bomber knowing you might not come back. He never glorified war. In interviews, when people asked him about his combat service, he'd deflect. He'd talk about the other men, the crews, the mechanics who kept the planes flying. He'd emphasize how terrified he was, how luck was the biggest factor in survival. But here's what made Stewart remarkable. He never pretended it didn't happen. Some veterans come home and lock that part of their life away. Stewart integrated it. The war made him a better actor. It gave him access to emotions and depths that made his post-war performances richer and more complex. Films like It's a Wonderful Life and Vertigo work because Stewart could tap into real darkness, real pain, real understanding of how fragile life is. As for Thunderbird, the P-51 continued its own remarkable journey. After Hoover's racing career, the aircraft passed through several owners, each one understanding they were custodians of something special. Today, Thunderbird is maintained by the Planes of Fame Air Museum in California, still airworthy, still occasionally flown at air shows. When that Merlin engine fires up and Thunderbird takes to the sky, it's not just a vintage aircraft. It's a living connection to the generation that fought World War II, to the pilots who flew these machines into combat, and to men like Jimmy Stewart who embodied the best of what that generation represented. So, what do we make of James Stewart? He was a man who could have coasted through World War II in safety and comfort, doing publicity tour and war bond rallies. Instead, he demanded to fly combat missions and became one of the most decorated officers in the Army Air Corps. He was a Hollywood star who never stopped being a soldier, rising to the rank of brigadier general while making some of cinema's greatest films. He was a father who sent his son to war and paid the ultimate price, carrying that grief silently for the rest of his life. And he was a pilot who never lost his love for flying, for those machines that represented both the terror of war and the triumph of human engineering. The P-51 Thunderbird, with its record-breaking speed and its connection to Stewart's world, stands as a symbol of all this. It's a reminder that the distance between Hollywood and the military, between acting and authentic service, between myth and reality, can be bridged by individuals who refuse to accept the easy path. James Stewart died in 1997 at the age of 89. The Air Force sent fighter jets to fly over his funeral in the missing man formation. In the crowd were veterans who'd served with him, actors who'd worked with him, and ordinary Americans who felt like they'd lost a friend they'd never met. But somewhere in California, Thunderbird sits in a hangar waiting. And when it flies, when that distinctive sound of the Merlin engine echoes across the sky, it carries with it the memory of a generation that faced unimaginable challenges and emerged victorious. Not because they were fearless, but because, like Jimmy Stewart, they were afraid and did it anyway. That's the real story. Not the sanitized Hollywood version, not the simplified narrative of heroism, but something more complex and more human. A man who struggled, who suffered, who made the choice every single day to live up to the values he believed in, even when it cost him everything. And in the end, that's what makes him unforgettable.